sometimes people come to you and ask about Bible movies or Bible TV shows, right? I know that right now a current big show for a lot of evangelical Christians, and some Catholic and Orthodox follow this as well, is this show The Chosen, which is sort of like supposed to be modeled after like a multi-season Netflix series of the life of Jesus, right? But when you think of Bible movies, you think of the Ten Commandments, right? And the greatest story ever told, right? These even Ben-Hur has a little bit of that in there as well. And sometimes people say, well, which one should I watch? Or like, which one do you like? And honestly, I've seen a lot. I have seen a lot because I'm always on the search for a good Bible movie. And I would have to say, probably with about 2 exceptions, they're all not really worth your time at all, right? And usually pretty bad. And you quickly find out that you can't tell a story without interpretation, right? So every single Bible movie sort of has its agenda, and then a lot of the Bible movies, especially from the evangelical world, are really not really a Bible movie. It's propaganda in the form of Bible movie, right? That are trying to get you to do something, as opposed to just displaying a story and a work of art. So for me, one of the movies I grew up with and I really like is The Prince of Egypt, which is, the story of Moses and everything like that. It was put together by DreamWorks, not Disney. A lot of people think it's a Disney movie. It's not a Disney movie, but it's a glorious soundtrack. It really encapsulates the story well. It obviously makes a lot of cuts and everything like that. But that's one for me. What about you, Father Geoffrey?
Yeah, I'm sympathetic to your point of view here. On the one hand, if you're a script writer, a movie director, a producer, you can understand the motivation to kind of go to this source material because there are no greater stories, to tell. These are, phenomenal things. And therefore it's relatively easy to make a case for doing this. And what's been remarkable, I think, in some of the ones you referred to, but over the generations, certainly since Hollywood has come around, almost every big name in Hollywood has participated in one of these or another. It's fascinating, right? And so you get this really weird thing happening where some of the greatest actors and actresses of their day, get involved in these projects, and they always fall short, don't they? Because it's something about the grand narrative that these are trying to tell that you can never quite measure up. There's a reason we have icons in churches and not, some sort of realistic, people can paint like photographs, it's a skill that certain people have, and sometimes it's very hard to tell the difference between them, but we don't do that with our icons. We deliberately express, and when we depict in a kind of visual medium, the scriptures, we deliberately do that in a kind of abstracted form because we know we cannot achieve the realism that's required. And you mentioned a word in there, interpretation, which is really, really important. Notice that even in the scriptures themselves, the way the story is told is that being there and having a realistic sort of camera's eye view of events would not have been adequate. There are plenty of people who had that and had no idea what was going on. It was always a matter of interpretation. So the icon, as opposed to the, film camera lens, is a matter of showing that that abstraction I'm talking about is actually the hermeneutic application to the story. It's showing the spiritual reality. It's theoria in an Orthodox sense, not just a kind of what you would call a neutral or objective camera lens. So there's a real problem with that. Now, to a certain extent, it can be good. I think sometimes we have overly spiritualized visions of things, and this can penetrate through it. So I will mention a film I do quite like, although it fails on all the same levels that everything else does. But that's Franco Zeffirelli's Jesus of Nazareth from the 1970s. Again, every big name in Hollywood at the time participated in this, and there's some phenomenal acting performances in it. It runs to over 6 hours, and I remember being shown this as a child, and I learned a lot about Jesus, from this, and ultimately it falls short. It's not an icon, and therefore it can't do the work that it's supposed to do. But to another extent, it does depict the humanity, for example, of the apostles and of figures like the women who followed Jesus, and sometimes when we only look at things through the lens of the icon, we can maybe sort of think of these, if we'd been there, we would have seen these powerful spiritual figures walking around, when usually they were, grubby, smelly, outcasts. They were not at the heart and seat of authority in their day, or attractive to the world. These were people that people avoided, and the implication is, where would I have been in this story, right? Would I have been with the ragtag outcasts, or would I have been with those who walked to the other side of the road to avoid these people? So there's a gritty realism that can be useful. Now, I just generally, I can't comment on a lot of these films because I just don't go and see them. Like, you might say, well, what does The Passion of the Christ do the same thing? Mel Gibson's epic. Maybe. I haven't gone, to see it. But my preference, if you have to make me watch any of these films, is the ones that are oblique to the biblical story. In other words, they say there's a really powerful story here, but let's pick up on it at the margin. I think you mentioned, Ben-Hur. Famously, there's The Robe, another 1950s film, which is about one of the Roman centurions, and just in the kind of aftermath of the events of Jesus. So it's not retelling the story of Jesus, it's what's happening, it's a kind of fictionalized account of what's happening around that. Or more recently, there was another film that came out, Risen, I believe it was 2016, wasn't it?
I saw Risen, and I didn't really like it that much.
Well, no, but I think, it's maybe not the perfect execution of it, but it's this example of an oblique take on it. We're not trying to kind of retell the story. I mean, I'll tell you, my favorite play of all time, just in a different mode here, is Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead by Tom Stoppard. It's not Hamlet, right? But it's the backstory and the side story of Hamlet, right? So, I mean, I would almost have preferred Peter Jackson when he did The Lord of the Rings, not to try to film that, because I think it fails on the same levels that all these biblical epics do. But maybe if he'd done the kind of life and times of Barlim and Butterbur, or like
Fatty Bulger, follow his story.
Exactly, and you kind of obliquely tell the story. So you're not ruining the grand narrative, but you're still in the same world, and so forth. And so along those lines, my favorite biblical story or film is The Life of Brian by Monty Python, which, I mean, is paradoxical in terms of a choice, because of course they famously promoted it by listing all the countries that banned it, because it was thought to be blasphemous or whatever.
It was it was big controversy when that movie came out.
Well, the production company even pulled the plug on their funding, and of all people, George Harrison of the Beatles stepped in and formed a film production company just to get it out into cinemas and everything, which was tremendous. But the point is, there's nothing blasphemous about that film. It is, in fact, one of the most, I think, quite ironically too, because the Pythons aren't known for their high level of spiritual achievement or acumen or whatever, but actually the story it tells and what it does in terms of puncturing religious pride and maybe the misapplication of the gospel through the ages is tremendous. It is a very, very profound and orthodox Christian film on that level, and it's really, really good. And so and anything it does, and I say, obliquely treats Jesus, because it's kind of this parallel life of a guy who's born like right next door in the stable next door to Jesus, and happens to kind of live a life that kind of mirrors Jesus. But the whole treatment of Jesus himself is done very respectfully, and in fact, he comes off really good in this. It's just all of the kind of weirdness around religion and the application of Jesus' teaching that get punctured in this film.
Yeah, and like Jesus is seen, but he's often seen at a distance, or there's, as you mentioned, this obliqueness to him, right? That one of the famous scenes is the Sermon on the Mount, except that Brian is with his mom at the very back of the crowd where they can barely hear what Jesus is saying, right? Yeah. And what's he saying? And someone turns around and says, "Blessed are the cheesemakers."
Of course,
right?
Well,
and then they have
it sound like,
and then they have a big discussion about, well, what's the meaning? It's about the principle of cheesemakers, right? And it's so hilarious. I've actually recommended that movie to people if they want to know what the religious fervor and the political tensions were like in the city of Jerusalem when Jesus was there.
Right. Is it the People's Front of Judea or the Judean People's Front and all that? Absolutely. It is actually one of the most historically sensitive, accurate depictions of first century Palestine that you can find. So no, I have no hesitation recommending, and I think it actually would make a really good study in a lot of churches to kind of watch that and to pick up on all of the kind of paradoxes and ironies of of the way that Jesus gets understood and misunderstood, right? Because it truly, I mean, I think the Pythons eventually said, no, it's not blasphemous, it's heretical. I don't even think it's heretical. So anyway, I highly recommend it. And it also punctures the pride of all of these other biblical films that are trying to do something that they just can't do, right? And so this works on so many levels that the others don't.
Therefore